Okay, so in part two of this week, I want to go through really how the cinema moved from Edison's single viewer machines into this display broadcast medium that we're actually familiar with. Now, what's important to note in this process is cinema evolved through an international process of innovation in different places. So there's no single inventor of the cinema like you can pin down with certain other things. Lots of developments in image making, camera technology, projection, exhibition. They took place in different places. Where the American film industry was superior, perhaps, is being able to take some of these innovations and combine them in the most efficient manner in order to create a coherent whole film industry. So, what am I talking about? Different pioneers. Well, you have Louis de Prince in 1888 in Leeds, filming moving images. So the first sort of operational camera of its kind to capture moving images. These were initially on glass, which isn't going to be that great in terms of display. Very fragile, very brittle. Can't really move it around. But later changed to celluloid. In 1889, he set up an exhibition to project them back, and that's seen by many people that Le Prince is the father of motion pictures. But yes, with a but, in that the images and the exhibition sent back wouldn't be what we considered to be motion picture at the time. If you look at Lumiere's cinematography, this was the first commercial projected show. This is probably closer to what we consider cinema to be. So Lumiere's project and their equipment could record, develop, and project film. So they had all the principles there. They had a paying audience on the 28th of December 1895 at the Salon Indien de Grand Café in Paris, showing 10 films of around 40 to 50 seconds. Now, I think this is closer to actually what cinema is. Actually, it has the recording, development, and projection of film in a venue specifically built for that purpose. I mean, the first films weren't exactly great. Workers leaving the factory. Okay, that's pretty crap, isn't it? But again, I want to go to the novelty aspect of this. Audiences wouldn't have seen anything like this before. They were amazed. They were seeing people moving towards them on screen. They were like, "Whoa, this is awesome! This is the greatest thing that's ever happened." Basically, what Edison was missing in his projects was projection. He had no concept of projecting outwards. So Jenkins and Armat invented a camera/projector by 95 called the phantoscope. Edison, if he wasn't anything, was resourceful. He just bought this off them and called it the Vitascope and used it for public exhibitions in New York City in 1896. So, Edison caught up with the Lumiere brothers in France very, very quickly, but was a little bit behind the curve, about a year behind what they were doing. So in 1896, you start to see a takeoff of this industry. Other competing devices start to emerge, copying the designs. Projectors start to be shown in music halls as a turn of 4 or 5 minutes with half a dozen films. So as an interlude between music hall acts. Plus, they start to get shown in theatres, opera houses, public halls, added onto the back of parlours as storefront theatres and travelling fairs. So they start to distribute widely without having a venue specifically for the projected image. And this was a really confusing period in many ways. People were exploiting novelty and competing US, I should say, that should be US in capital, sorry, American and foreign systems weren't compatible with one another. There were technical differences. There were all sorts of problems with projection, with difficulty of making enough films. Once you'd seen one, you couldn't have seen them all because, you had seen them all. There were very few about. You were waiting for new stuff all the time. There was a low startup cost, though, which meant that many people joined this new industry very quickly. So the proliferation of products, but often very poor quality, terrible products rather than good quality things. And the early films were all much of a muchness. Many vaudeville acts, music hall acts, passion plays and prize fights were very popular. Some comedies such as, The Gardener and the Hosepipe. There's no water coming out of the hosepipe. I'll look into it. Oh, I got covered in water. Absolutely brought the house down, that sort of thing. Some showing political scenes or events, but many were actualities, scenes of everyday life, like our friend John with the sneeze. Those kind of things were really popular. It became the cinema of attractions. So if you look at Tom Gunning's 1986 article on early film, what you tended to get was successive, unrelated shorts showcasing the thrill of moving photographs, but very little else. No narrative, no nothing like that. No dramatic impulse, almost just very quick images which would show, wow, there's short sharp things which would show that this is an interesting medium. So these were instant attractions for very short-term amusement. Now that kind of thing shows an awareness of audience and performance, and the fact that you have a viewer, and there's a keen awareness there of the audience wants this kind of thing. But what happens is the audience becomes very bored of this very quickly. Just to go back to some of these things, so smash hit, The Arrival of a Train at La Ciotat in 1895 with the Lumiere brothers. Basically, this image was basically a train arriving. Now, it is a kind of a well-worn cliche, but people did run when they saw the train coming towards them. Some people did, not everyone, but some people were watching this, they go, oh my god, there's a train coming, and they ran out of the room. So there was that kind of visual effect and a thrill to it. If you have a look at this image here, it might give you an understanding of what we're talking about. I mean, it's pretty good stuff. Got this dude running. It's pretty exciting. Got the music going on. It's pretty awesome. That music would have usually been played by a pianist in the place as well. And here they come. Get off the train. That dude's thinking, yeah, I'm on camera here. I'm gonna be the star of this. Now, it's not much, right? I mean, it's not the most amazing thing that's ever been made, but do you know what? That's still better than Sex and the City and Sex and the City 2 combined. I still enjoyed that a lot more. So, there's something to be said for it, and early audiences were thrilled by this kind of thing. So I think I just missed a slide, by the way, but don't worry about it, it wasn't that important. So other experiments that occurred. So you get large screen projections. At the Paris World Fair in 1900s, you get a 21 meter by 18 meter screen. That is a phenomenal size of screen. You wouldn't get screens that size these days. And so people are messing around with the form and trying to perfect projection and this idea that you can have substantial form things and really manipulate audiences through size and scale. Sound recording experiments start to come about around 1900, so recordings to be played alongside film. There was synchronization problems with this, but at least the early cinematic pioneers had a good awareness that it wasn't just the moving images that was important, sound would also be an important thing. And you start to see early color experiments. Now, there was no such thing as color film at that point in time, but you start to see tinting of film, and early research into color photography wouldn't really start to become popular for another 30-40 years, but it will start to become useful for another 30-40 years. However, the sort of early attempts at doing this are interesting. But film is still kind of boring. The novelty wore off. People got sick of seeing like little shorts of everyday scenes and things like that. Once you've seen one, you've seen them all. People wanted more, and film was saved actually by news. Because there was too few films to sustain an audience, there needed to be something that would capture people's interest. And amazingly, it was the Spanish-American War of April to August 1898 that saved film as a medium in its early days. You might ask, well, what happened in this? What happened in this war? I haven't even heard of this war. Okay, well, it was the American intervention in the Cuban War of Independence versus Spain on the side of Cuba. The American state and American businessmen had significant interest in Cuba at the time, and it was in their interest that Cuba become an independent country and liberate itself from Spain, so America could kind of exploit Cuba even more. As the Americans interjected, the battleship Maine was sunk in Havana Harbor on the 15th of February 1898, killing 266 American seamen. Fairly colossal event in American military history, and this really was important news for the American state. This war had two fronts, both in Cuba and the Philippines. Spain and America were really going at it. Now, American cameramen went to Cuba to record some of the footage that was going on in Cuba of the conflict and send it back to America, send this film back. Very short distance between America and Cuba. It's only about 90 miles from Cuba to the southern point of Florida. And there was a huge public demand for this material. And you had a combination of real images of the war and fictional images produced by studios being projected in film theaters, and it became huge. People started to swallow this up. Theaters became arenas for patriotic participation, and literally audiences would participate. They would get up, they would shout, they would go nuts at the screen. They really wanted to see all this stuff. It became boom time for cinema again, and they tapped into this notion of patriotic participation, which became incredibly important in the First World War. Cinema went with war like hand in hand. Cinema became a collective medium. You're projecting to a group of people. You could get, collective feeling towards a particular incident or particular set of incidents. It became a broadcast medium which pulled people together and gave it the role of a visual newspaper as well. You're telling stories, and you're telling sort of incidents to people in a visual medium. So other news events would become very, very popular, like the Boxer Rebellion in China of 1899, the Boer War, the 1905 Russo-Japanese War. These would all become hugely important events in terms of the development of cinema and in terms of how cinema reported the world. Hand in hand with this was a turn from these early films of phenomena in life to narrative. Now, narrative existed obviously in print, existed in theatre and had done for centuries. Even things like magic lanterns told stories. Cinemas were stuck showing successive factual scenes or small events, and its success was built on realism. So it took a long time for narrative to actually develop. But once people got into narrative and really started making narrative pieces, cinema flew. It started to go crazy. And really the pioneer of narrative is Georges Méliès, a French illusionist who directed 531 films. Yeah, check that out, in 17 years, from 1896 to 1913. Now, he began with films of special effects and tricks, but in 1896 discovered something called a stop trick as a very accidental edit. And the stop trick allowed him to develop narrative scenes in movies. By editing in this very innovative way, he could actually start telling a story with the images that he put together. He developed narratives such as A Trip to the Moon and The Impossible Voyage. Relied on really kind of spectacular imagery in his films. You can see up in the top left there, that is Impossible Voyage, where he treats the film in a particular way, so it looks like it's a color production, but it isn't. This is from Trip to the Moon, on the bottom right there. Indeed, this kind of filmmaking technique became so influential it was still being used when I was a kid in the 90s. Ooh, I'll put that video up on on Canvas for you guys, because I've just skipped. I don't know why it didn't play, but it didn't kick in. But don't worry about it. It's only Smashing Pumpkins. You won't worry about it. This interjection of narrative into cinema brought with it a need to understand an emerging new language, and that is the film grammar. So with narrative, you start to see the beginning of what we call film grammar. Now, this is largely, I guess, what you guys have been studying with Joanna in Teaching Block 1 in Introduction to Film Studies, how to read films, how to understand how meaning is constructed in this medium, and how to decode that meaning effectively. At the very start of film grammar, what you have, the scenes needed to be edited together to tell a story, and a language of film has to be created. So really, the principles of film studies and the grammar of film start to get laid down when narrative becomes a feature of cinema around the turn of the century, very, very early part of the 20th century. So you start, these innovations are really, really important, and very, very prescient in terms of what's going to happen in cinema as we go forward. Narrative obviously is a very, very important part of cinema, although if you watch things like the Transformers movies, you would be surprised that that is even the case. By early 1900s, again, film novelty starts to wear off again, so it's actually saved by narrative films. Even the news aspect of it starts to become a bit tiresome for people, but narrative movies really save the film industry once again. And what you start to see with narrative films is a movement from short to longer multi-shot films telling short stories. These competed much better with the music hall and with live performance. And in 1905, you see the emergence of a very important aspect of cinema itself, the emergence of specific venues for narrative cinema. Henry Davis opens the first Nickelodeon in Pittsburgh. Nickelodeon because it costs a nickel to go in, and it's an Odeon, it's a viewing place. So the Nickelodeon, the first really exclusively built motion picture theatres, continuous 10 to 30 minute programs of films for 5 cents, the nickel, led to a Nickelodeon boom. So after 1905 opening, by 1914, 9 years later, 14,000 of these venues in the United States alone. Alongside a lot of cheaper storefront shows and theatre halls, you start to see a re-emergence of cinema very, very quickly as being a very important cultural form in American society. Nickelodeons could go from looking, very big, very nice, like the Princess Theatre then, in New York City, to much smaller, less formal sort of ones, but they spring up everywhere. And this form of, very short films, which you pay a very little amount of money for, you can get your entertainment for 20 minutes, half an hour, and you're happy and you move on with your life. The interiors were all kind of standard, but that standardization is very important. For the first time, we see the screen dominant in the space, all the audience arranged towards the screen in this way. You're not having to readapt theatres or anything like that, storefront parlours in order to show films. You have a custom built auditorium for showing cinema and really setting how cinema will be shown in the future also. Nickelodeons were very cheap, aimed at a mass audience, aimed specifically, again, at passing trade, much like the Panorama was many decades before this, especially lunch break white-collar workers in cities. With the practice of going to a Nickelodeon, for a matinee showing was called nooning. Plus, they were very popular with women, children, and immigrants. Because of the move towards narrative cinema, you had less of an emphasis towards things which, boys and men enjoyed, like boxing fights and things like that. Far less of that going on now. Stories started to come into it, and actually people started to enjoy them on the basis of a far wider range of interest rather than just like two guys beating each other up. Film exchanges started to develop where they would rent out films to theatres. Now, this is a very important development because it meant the theatres themselves didn't have to have business relationships with the sort of newly emerging studios. There was a distribution system put in place for these things, which meant you could very quickly have new films come into your Nickelodeon to maintain popularity. You weren't stuck with the same picture all of the time. And it meant that you weren't competing with other places necessarily by showing them the same thing. You several Nickelodeons in the same city could have completely different films going on. The success of the Nickelodeon led to an increased demand for films themselves, leading to far more film production. You see the build-up of an industry here. As success happens in the Nickelodeons, you say to this, these emerging studios, we need more films. They're like, right, we're going to produce more films. So we're going to need more cameramen, we're going to need more people in production, we're going to need more actors, we're going to need more screenwriters, we're going to need more of everything. And the whole thing starts to burgeon outwards. And there was a boom in attendance. 26 million Nickelodeon visitors a week in the United States by 1910. A huge number of people. So Nickelodeon very, very quickly became a very, very popular form of entertainment. Now, Nickelodeons were not without criticism. They were unregulated completely, and how they spread was completely unregulated, and this was really problematic because the buildings themselves were often quite dangerous. There were poor safety features. poor working conditions, and in particular there were a lot of fire hazards. If anyone's, I suspect some of you have seen the film Inglourious Bastards by Quentin Tarantino, and the end of that film shows the power of celluloid film as an inflammatory substance, right? You know, as Shoshana burns down the cinema with all the Germans inside. The nitrate film used in Nickelodeons was extremely flammable, and Nickelodeon owners weren't really that concerned with safety, and a lot of them burned down. Quite a few of them with people in them as well. So yeah, they weren't exactly the safest place in the world. They were overcrowded, unhealthy, airless, smelly, polluted places very often. People actually wanted more than this in the experience. So the Nickelodeon boom kind of killed itself off in many ways because of these factors. But there was also a set of moral criticisms attached, though. You know, the popularity of this form with the working classes and the effect upon women, children, and immigrants was very much picked on by the sort of middle-class bourgeoisie who had their own strict moral code. If you remember back to the photography lecture, I talked about this in some depth. So there are actually campaigns against cinema and the Nickelodeons by middle-class and religious groups, saying that, you know, these things were corrupting the moral character of the United States. And anti-vice groups called for censorship. And you really have the first instance here of censorship of media in the broadcast era. We've talked a lot about censorship in terms of newspapers and so on, but this was, you know, a different time. In the electronic era, we're now talking about censorship. Nickelodeon set up their own board of censorship in 1909 in order to censor pictures and in order to enforce this moral code that people wanted to put on them. The calls for censorship were very obviously class-based, but health and safety campaigns were very successful. New legislation closed many Nickelodeons or raised the costs, hastening the demise of Nickelodeons by 1915. But as we go into the third video, we'll see how cinema moved from the Nickelodeon era into the golden era of cinema just after the First World War. See you in a bit.